We're going to get started here with the session on new energy technologies and policies. My name is Richard Weiner. I'm with Research Corporation, and I'll be the chair of the session. We have three invited talks. This session is sponsored by the Forum on Physics and Society. So if you're interested in these kind of issues, I encourage you, if you're not already a member of the forum, to sign up on the APS website. It's easy to do, and I don't think it costs anything to be a member of the forum. So our first speaker is going to be Lil Kammen, and I will turn it over to him.
Well, thank you so much for all being here, and thanks for setting up such an important session on a key topic. And I'm hoping that this actually is a mixture of some of the up-to-date things that we're doing in our team at Berkeley, but it's also an advertisement for physics students who decide this is an area to move into, which you'll see again and again is kind of a piece of the story. This will be a little bit of a mix of introduction for those who don't think, live, and breathe the climate, so the climate response story, and a little bit about the different groups working on various topics. And so at Berkeley, I run a research laboratory called the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. I'll give a very short introduction to that. I'll talk about a little bit to the degree to which our energy systems, both at the state and not so much national level, but other nations, are transitioning very rapidly, and then really highlight what is some of the interesting ideas to think about decarbonization from kind of a big picture physics perspective down to some very mundane aspects of how do you sort of translate some of the physics, chemistry, economics into practice. And I'll try to end with that and really highlight a social and environmental justice question that'll come up at the end that resonates with many of the debates around the so-called Green New Deal, the Ocasio-Cortez story and all. So again, I'll start with a little bit of the introduction to the laboratory. I am a physicist from my upbringing, and I had the best possible benevolent, wonderful leader, sort of advisors. My freshman advisor was Hans Bethe. You can't really go wrong from there, or maybe you say it's all downhill from there. And David Merman was my advisor as an undergraduate, so I worked on a lot of dynamics of solid-state systems. And I say that not just to highlight the fact that I have a credential, but it's going to come back up in some of the analysis that we are doing of global energy systems. I did actually take my postdoc in a different direction. We did models of the visual cortex that were actually inspired by Alan Guth's inflationary universe. I won't go into that now. That's a Q&A sort of a connection. But getting from Harvard to MIT for one class a day is not easy, turned out. My laboratory is an interesting and fairly diverse place. There's people from all kinds of interesting places, like from Navajo Nation, from Chile, Argentina, Trinidad, Canada. This person's from the developing country of Washington, D.C. We'll come back to those places later on. And again, the laboratory website is here. Turns out you need to put in some qualifier if you Google it. If you just type in rail, you'll get the Raelians who claim to have cloned a human a few years ago and haven't heard much from them since. And the Twitter is not my vacation pictures. It's one tweet a day, plus or minus 2, from work in the laboratory, if you want to kind of follow some of the things we do. Our students mainly come from physics and engineering backgrounds. The lab is about 60% physicists and then an admixture of other areas. And they've gone on to all kinds of interesting things. President Obama's climate science advisor, the lead of something called Power for All, the head of public health epidemiology for the City of London, a whole variety of kind of interesting types of projects just to illustrate where this sort of thing goes. The head of MIT's largest thin film solar laboratory, and then some kind of master's and undergraduate students as well. Again, this laboratory has existed for 20 years since I moved to Berkeley, and the first big project we'd worked on was really doing my physics into energy systems work. We did a lot of work on the early days of the so-called IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for which we contributed to, didn't share, but contributed to the Nobel Peace Prize. And as you know from reading the books like Losing the Nobel Prize, more than 3 people can't win the prize. Very interesting comment. And so the 4 of us at Berkeley that contributed to the IPCC's prize, we shared it with Al Gore. So there were several thousand of us, one Al Gore. So I guess we're micro-Gores is the unit of analysis. But Berkeley didn't know what to do with it because you don't get a check. But the key thing, of course, on many university campuses, particularly at Berkeley, more important than the check to some, is the parking space that you get from winning the Nobel Prize. But we didn't actually get one because we didn't get the whole story. So Berkeley, after 10 years, decided they would reward us with Nobel laureate bicycle parking. And if you read the fine print, you'll say parking not reserved for IPCC contributors, all cyclists welcome. So it's a very Berkeley kind of response. Our lab has taken this kind of energy and technical systems approach to a whole variety of energy, decarbonization, transition questions, developing something that Science of America voted as its world-changing idea for 2009. It was incredibly simple. It was basically fund property owners to invest in energy efficiency and clean energy and let them pay it back as if it was a mortgage. This turned out to have been very poorly timed because it was when the housing crisis happened, and so this was an extra debt. It took almost 10 years for this idea to really get back into full throttle. And what I'll come back to in the end is that we work with a whole number of governments. I'm just back yesterday from Morocco and Kenya, where we're working on models of their power system. I'll come back to in a bit. And I'm going to highlight this area of energy storage as we move through thinking about how to really accelerate the transition of energy systems worldwide. And of course, the reason why we have to do that is because we're moving far too slowly. And so this next short section is, again, too quick a tutorial for those who don't think about energy a lot and boring for all of those like Amory who do it every day. So go to sleep for a few minutes, Amory. But essentially, I would say that we've had more than 20 years of these annual climate meetings. They're in nice places, or often nice places, and they weren't really going anywhere. There was the Kyoto Protocol that was interesting, didn't really do anything. But before the Paris meeting in 2015, the United States and China basically said a version of the following story. Look, we're the G2 of energy and pollution. US and China, 40% of the world's energy use and pollution. If we choose to do it, it will change the landscape. Europeans don't like to hear that for reasons I won't get into here. But essentially a handshake agreement where these two countries said, we're just going to blast ahead. We're going to set incredibly aggressive goals, or sort of incredibly aggressive goals. Of course, US under current has moved away from those goals, and that was to cut emissions by 2030 by 2025. By 1/3. China's goals that really annoyed many of my physicist friends, because what China said is they would peak their emissions at an unspecified number. So D emissions, DT was going to be 0 in 2030. Of course, that meant 1% over current numbers, or 1,000%, really pissed people off. But China is going to meet its 2030 goal probably 5 or 6 years ahead of schedule. And that is something which is remarkable in thinking through what you can do. And the reason why it's so critical, of course, is that the US and China are this huge kind of 40% or more of global emissions. There's an interesting story about how the US has backed away from its goals, and a different story where China has doing better and better things domestically, still lots of problems, but dirtier and dirtier things overseas through its Belt and Road Initiative, something we won't get into here. The overall picture, this is what every good energy climate scientist has tattooed somewhere on their body. This was the pre-Paris path to warm the planet by an average of more than 4.5 degrees C, which means the poles would be warming by perhaps 10 or 15 or more degrees. And essentially what happened is, after the US and China said this, people glommed onto a whole variety, a very diverse set of different things they would do. And what everyone promised to do in Paris, lubricated by good wine and good events, was to cut off all of these emissions. That's a remarkable first step. It's nowhere near enough to get down to what was the agreed upon guardrail, that we shouldn't warm the planet by more than 2 degrees C, recognizing we've already warmed the planet by 1 degree, so not a lot of headroom left. Since this happened, the new IPCC report has highlighted what's really more close to reality, and that is that we need to be at 1.5 degrees C or less. And if 2 degrees C gets us in gigatons of emissions down to about here, you don't have to be a physicist like you all to recognize there is a very complicated world that I won't get into today of having to go carbon negative. Everything from growing more trees, making agriculture smart, things I am very strongly in favor of, to things I'm far less in favor of in a very complex world of geoengineering, which I'm pretty sure will come up in the Q&A. So we all committed to this. We've barely done it yet, but that's what we all said we would do. And again, fueled by the excitement of doing so, we need to do all of these innovations. But right after the Paris Accord, another accord, much less talked about, the Kigali Accord, was proposed, developed, and signed in the matter of 6 months that would cut off another 0.5 degree, largely through industrial and refrigerants. And this is a remarkable feature. We committed to all this. There is only one country on the planet that is on schedule to meet their 2050 goal, and I will give a prize to the student that can say and shout out what country is on target. Finland is far off. It's Morocco. We'll get into that perhaps later on. An aspect of the story that is lost on many of the policy people but is second nature to all the physicists here is that if that's our path of emissions, this is a paper we did with Cristina Figueres, who's now head of the European Climate Foundation, who was head of this climate, basically the climate meetings each year, the COP meetings as they're called, the Conference of the Parties, is this trivial feature, and that is if we have to get down to 20% or if we reduce emissions by 80% or more for that 2 degree goal, and between 80 and 100, or maybe 80 and 120% if we're going to go carbon negative for these goals, there is a big challenge in we keep increasing our emissions, and so it's a longer path. But from my perspective, the much harder story is not the reduction amount, the magnitude, but the slope of the line. And that is because if we started early in the past, that would be nice. This is about a 3 degree average slope, the blue. If we take the amber or whatever color that is, it's 4, and the red is 5 degrees. And if we look at places on the planet that have achieved that level of decarbonization through efficiency, moving to clean energy, et cetera, for any length of time, there's only 2 big examples. California has done it for just about under a decade, and China did it for about half a decade in terms of maintaining the blue, the 3 degree. No one has ever done it for decade after decade. And so if you think about what that means in terms of doubling and tripling down on continued reductions, this is really the challenge. And the subtlety of that is not part of the wider conversation. It's yet another reason why kind of the physics angle is so critical. So because of the work our lab was doing, I was invited to play a federal role. Science Envoy sounds like a great title. It doesn't mean you're an unpaid volunteer. So I was appointed by President Obama working for Secretary Kerry with a number of Middle Eastern and African nations on a whole variety of projects, mainly to push for energy efficiency in countries that have not done much on it, and then to really try to scale up clean energy projects in places like Morocco that have done really remarkable things. It's nice to get a nice letter afterwards when you're working on it, but of course, we did have a little change of administration. Kind of troubling in a few ways, and we really stepped away from the direction I was on, so I did resign from my federal role, and so I wrote a longish letter explaining why and citing some Republican presidents, et cetera, and I tried to learn from my daughters, who are much more savvy on social media. So there's the letter, and of course I had to tweet it out because that's how you communicate with this president. I found out even when I was in his presence. But no one read the letter at all because there was this little message embedded in it. And every reporter who called me that day asked if it was intentional. I said, really? Is it possible that I randomly selected the first letter of each paragraph in this acrostic? But what I learned from my kids was that if you're going to do this, you have to tweet it out. And since I live in California, you have to tweet out very early in the morning, 5 or 6, so it's early in the morning on the East Coast. And Europe is still active, and you have to get your most well-known acquaintance or friend to retweet it for you. So I thought very hard, and I reached out and asked such a person to do so, and she was kind enough to do that. And by the end of the first day, as my daughter called from school, I was out trending Drake and the Migos and various things. It was an interesting jab, but the question is, did one walk away from the good work at State Department to kind of make a little grandstanding statement? What we've seen since with this administration is really challenging. So I think it was the right thing to do, but what it highlights, though, is how long-term planning is really critical. And so this is the second most famous plot, I would say, in the energy decarbonization world, and it was made by one of Enrico Fermi's grad students, Art Rosenfeld, who was receiving a medal from President Obama, and back when PowerPoint meant a drafts person, he basically looked at the energy path we were on for California, and if we chose to be much more efficient, something you'll hear from Amory, because his soft energy paths was the policy action statement when he began advising President Carter. And so essentially the argument was, if you can cut away unneeded energy by being more efficient, by being more flexible, more distributed, you could save huge amounts of money, energy, and carbon in the process. And Art and Amory, I would say, are the two leading figures on getting this mentality in place. And it's been remarkable. California's kilowatt hours per person consumption here with that of the United States ramping up roughly the same, OPEC energy crisis, and then through a very sustained effort to think through savings in all different sectors, electricity use in California has essentially remained flat from a time when no one went to school with much electronics to what we have today. And there's much more to be said about what amount of that was due to companies maybe leaving California to be in a more carbon-friendly economy, but this is an absolutely transformative idea. And if you go back and read economic theory, Scientific American articles back in this time, you will see something called White's Law, that literally people were saying culture, among other things, evolves as the amount of energy consumption goes up. Obvious today, but just a transformative idea. And without ideas like that, I maintain the things we're trying to do now wouldn't just be incredibly hard. There would be no empirical data that this kind of world transition was possible. So an example that's old hat for some places in Europe, like the Netherlands that have already done it, we proposed in 2007 that California should license it so no new home can be built in the state that doesn't generate as much energy as it needs. We didn't say solar. If you want to have, a small modular nuke in the basement, that would technically be legal on some grounds, not on others. But this took another 8 years to get through. California builds 200,000 homes a year. It's about a sixth of all homes built nationwide. And so coming next year, this is a pretty remarkable kind of step. Took a long time to get through, which is one reason why stepping away from these federal roles comes with a loss of momentum to some degree. But California didn't just pass this that we know how to do. California also passed this that we don't know how to do. And it's really exciting to see the science about decarbonization enable politicians to then say, well, we're also going to stake ourselves to a goal that we do not know how to do today, and expect this interplay of policy and investing in science, technology, and behavior to get us to things, because obviously the energy needs per square meter of floor area for these much larger buildings is a big deal. More recently, California has passed a more aggressive version that I'll show graphically in a second, and that is California's initial goal for clean energy was to be 20% powered by renewables, which I'll define in a second, by 2010. We missed the goal through a party, met it in 2013. California's goal for 2020 is 33%. We're already at 37%. And the goal for 2030 was 50% until we passed this new law, Senate Bill 100, for 100%. California's goal is now 100% powered by clean energy by 2045. carbon negative thereafter. And that 2030 goal is now 60%. And by essentially everyone's assessment, we are clear. I mean, obviously, we've already made this goal. This will be a challenge, but it's certainly doable. California, fifth largest economy, routinely runs in the high 70% carbon-free, with the footnote that some people feel that large hydro is carbon-free, others do not. In California, we do not count nuclear. We do not count large hydro towards these goals. And there's a subtlety around these are renewable standards, and that's clean energy to keep the potential future nuclear people who will do something dramatically different in the future than what they're doing today. And Amory will have comments on that. And just for full disclosure, I'm a professor of nuclear engineering, and I am quite skeptical that's a possibility. So all of this is a long warm-up to what are some of those physics tools that are really useful. One of the things that my lab has built is very similar to that dynamical systems linear oscillator work that I showed early on in my sort of pure physics days. And that is to model not only the largest and most complex machine that we've arguably ever built, which are the power grids, but also to integrate in current assets like current coal and gas and nuclear plants with the rapidly growing and today much cheaper, not subsidized, but much cheaper clean energy options, current and new transmission assets, both AC and DC systems, storage systems like the world's largest molten salt facility, or at least it was when I visited 2 weeks ago in Morocco. You can never tell how quickly China's moving. And then high kilowatt hour batteries, both some stationary ones and then some of these mobile ones that are coming, and then future technologies such as potentially fusion in other areas. So what we've built is a large linear programming model to think through all of those choices, every transmission line, every power plant, efficiency programs. We put it into a big, wonderful linear program where we minimize the net present value of the costs of all of our current things, and we have to meet peak demand, et cetera. In this talk with 9 minutes and 17 seconds left, I won't do the details, but if you go to the Switch site, we have detailed papers on many aspects of it. And currently, we have Switch models that are actively being used by not just my group, but partners at universities and in the governments of all the places in green here. Our largest team is in China. After we built Switch for California and then the Western North American Integrated Grid, the so-called WEC, we built Chile, then Kenya, Nicaragua. Mexico comes online. It might actually be online today. We're working in the Balkans, in Bangladesh. In India, we built the model, but we're not allowed to release it because we got the data at a moment of political weakness in India during the blackouts when they gave us the data, and now they regret that, and so we have not published the model. But it's basically a big tool to think through which scenarios. Very aggressive on solar. We've already gotten there to some degree. Very aggressive on batteries, for example, something I'll mention in a second. If you're a proponent of carbon capture and storage, of which I am not, or nuclear, of which I am not for current technology, but I'm ever hopeful the world may change. And then other cases, California has proposed closing down all of its big hydro, which provides 8% of state power, or keeping the hydro that remains only basically as big batteries. We would never want to do the anti-Amory case of not being efficient, but these are all different cases that would meet the 2-degree goal, not necessarily the 1.5 degree. We're running the next set of scenarios on that. My favorite scenarios are super, super aggressive on solar, on efficiency, and on energy storage. And what you get if you're a power engineer is a world in mid-century which looks nothing like the way most utilities grew up, where we have lots of baseload power, baseload hydro, baseload coal, baseload nuclear, and then a little bit of other stuff on the top. This is a world that is smart, dynamic, and requires an interaction of energy systems and smart control systems that is very different than anything we've thought about before, which is one of the reasons why it is so hard in so many places around the world to get utilities staffed by currently trained engineers to be willing to think the different kind of thoughts you're going to hear by the 2 next speakers. It's not that they're inherently opposed, although some are. It's that they have zero familiarity with a world which is basically the kind of social media type of interaction. In the old days, if you wanted to turn on certain hydro plants that would sell power to California from Montana, you had to physically reach the operator on the phone and say, please turn this up. And I know because I went and met him at his home in Billings, and he said, yeah, when I was out fly fishing, we didn't turn it up because you couldn't reach me. That is not an okay version of the world we need to be in. So it's an interesting picture, and we do lots of detailed work about routing the power, AC power flow, reactive power, et cetera, et cetera. We also work, as I mentioned, in the biggest power system in the world with university partners to get connected on in. And the current debate in China is not how quickly they can close down power plants. It's how quickly they can absorb the world's largest and fastest growing fleet of electric vehicles, not just for transportation, but also as a mobile form of storage, so-called vehicle-to-grid tied systems, to really think very differently. That's where the conversation is right now in China. They have the highest mandate and standards and production levels for electric vehicles, lots of challenges and things that are missing, but another part of the story, and it's where the kind of the physics system thinking is so critical, is that you are not going to save the world. You're going to make the world better or preserve it by getting rid of all internal combustion vehicles, as France and Ireland have now committed to do. Volvo has already said they won't make any more combustion vehicles after 2021. Those are neat statements. Very few people predicted 10 years ago that was possible, maybe very few except for Amory. But there is a bigger systems dynamic picture which is lost on many places, and that is you can have just a bad traffic jam, just as long commute times in your electric vehicle as your gas vehicle. And so we're working on things like understanding the degree to which housing policy is in fact climate policy, and it's a social justice disgrace that the poorest people in many of our cities commute hours a day to go serve the rich people who have homes right by where they live. So there is a big debate, and when Scott Wiener and I published this 2 weeks ago, I have to say you really recognize you're skewering some sacred cows. The number of people said this is a socialist affront to our ability to buy homes wherever we want and to create neighborhoods, translation, racially segregated the way we want. Bit of a firestorm. Some of the economics of how fast the green energy process has gone are so remarkable. If you drive today in a regular vehicle, you can be 14 cents a mile in terms of your cost. If you go to a hybrid, cut it in half. Electricity from the grid, cut it down again. And with solar now so cheap, we're talking about 1 cent per kilowatt hour, meaning unsubsidized, it's cheaper than any of the fossil fuel options. We're talking about driving an order of magnitude cheaper with electricity from solar than traditional sources. That is a transformative idea. So this is a graph that only a group of physicists could or should love. This is the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory's annual update of the max efficiency of solar cells of different types of single crystalline, multicrystalline, thin film, and quantum dots and perovskites and emerging technologies. And I highlight this because I make every one of my new students dig into this, because even though efficiency of a solar cell is only one metric, and arguably cost per kilowatt hour is a much more useful practical metric, there is a huge amount you can glean in terms of the rate of change, how did investments in R&D or deployment programs, so-called technology push on the R&D side, or market pull, really change this feature. And so you can see the slopes roughly on here, but of course we've got lower down but more dramatically, rapidly increasing slopes of some of these new technologies. So it's really exciting. And of course, this leads to Moore's law, the learning curve. In very trivial form, we know empirically that the cost roughly follows a power law with the volume of production. Everyone in the energy field uses this. I always use it, and I hate it for the obvious reason, and that is that it does wonderfully predict what we see in terms of the cost. And so, of course, time is just a date stamp along this curve of innovations. But I really object intellectually to the fact that it's a one-parameter fit to just the production capacity. Well, some of the numbers are great. Solar costs down in the 1 cent per kilowatt hour range. It's quite remarkable. And it's led to a huge revolution in off-grid technologies, which I'm just going to skip. Small distributed technologies available in all kinds of parts of the world that don't have access to power. But here's a summary of learning curves for ethanol and biofuels, which has some land use problems. For the solar, we've talked about wind, NOx controls, and we can only call this I guess, a forgetting curve. I'm going to leave that for the debate later on. But the area where I'm most excited is storage, because storage, like solar, is a diverse set of many different materials, and that's its strength. And it's not just about Tesla. It's about everything from nickel metal hydride to the technology I am physically installing myself and lots of mini grids around the world, which are flow batteries that, unlike our phones that have a few thousand cycles, have millions of cycles, and you can add to them quite remarkably. And as we look at these data sets more and more, I've been, of course, playing around with these learning curves and trying to find ways to think and fit data where we're looking at how does the investment in R&D play in. And of course, you add more variables, you have more fitting parameters, you have to make sure you're doing better than that. My current favorite metric is not dollars spent on R&D or patents. It's actually, and this is hard to gather data for, people who don't finish their PhD. People who finish their PhD become academics and do nothing. Right? People who don't finish their PhD but are committed go out and actually found companies and go into things. And so gathering data on those who didn't finish the degree and go do things is an interesting place to go. In California, we use that switch model to force the utilities to install big flow battery systems. I'm going to skip all that and just end with one feature here, and that is that the Green New Deal is really a dialogue not about clean energy, but about equity. And if we look where solar's been installed in the United States, what we sadly find is that the subsidies, the training programs have massively benefited exactly who you would sadly expect. When you look at where solar is, what we observe is that solar isn't just for the affluent, which kind of makes sense, but even when you control for income, solar is massively more present in white communities than in Latino or black communities. And there's lots of arguments about why this happened, but in terms of thinking through this next generation of these technologies, as we see these prices going so low for solar and storage and other things, this is an unacceptable part of the story, not just on ethical grounds, which I think should be enough, but you will never get the kind of transformative movement unless this really doesn't just catch up with equity, but actually promotes equity. And so there's huge areas of social justice that come out of this kind of very quant data science kind of analysis. So again, thanks so much. And yeah, I'll just put up the last picture and go from there. So thank you.
Okay. We have time for a couple questions. If you're going to ask a question, why don't you come up and use the mic, because we're recording this.
And just announce who you are, because they're doing the recording.
So I'm Ben Tannenbaum with San Diego National Labs. You talk a lot about what's going on in the science technology world, a little bit about what's going on in the policy world, but you didn't address the regulatory world at all. And I feel like that's a spot where there's a lot of work that has to be done, because much of the people, for example, in the production and distribution of electricity, they're about making money. And we're starting to see changes where they're making it too expensive for me to put rooftop solar on. So what's going on there?
So to me, policy and regulatory world are actually one and the same. In the places that are being aggressive about policy, California, now New Mexico is committed to these same goals, New York State, it's always a dance between setting new rules and making sure that there is a business behind it. And that's why I really mentioned the story about utilities and the older style thinking. We have fascinating examples of regulatory policies, both at the state level and slightly at the federal office, although right now you can imagine that's not my favorite place to get action, where installing solar, installing energy storage are being made more and more profitable. Many utilities fight their own ability to make more money. And there's a very simple data point. Almost every utility, even those that have good policies on paper, oppose electric vehicles. And they have lots of reasons around, oh, we're going to have distributed power, we're going to have to pay for upgrades and this and that. All around the country, getting electric vehicles in use is basically stealing money from the oil industry and giving it to utilities. And utilities have fought this tooth and nail because of really retrograde thinking. That's an example where regulation and policymaking go hand in hand. So one of the things we've done in California is we're working on a new version of, if you build a home under this, you have to be net zero for 2020, and there's no gas, because why would you want to build gas into it? Because we have a price on carbon. If you build a home with no gas, you and the developer get a rebate equal to the 20-year cost of the gas infrastructure plus the carbon payments you would do. And if you buy an electric vehicle, when you either buy a new home or a home changes hands, you get a fraction off, probably half a basis point off on your interest rate to encourage that all electric living. So there's lots of examples of it not working. You're absolutely right. But there's also examples of places where this is a really interesting opportunity, but everyone's got to partner up. And there have been some real short-sighted actors in the game.
Stephen Lambert from APS. I really love hydroelectricity. I mean, it's clean. It seems to me like a winner, but you seemed really down on it. Can you just say more about that?
Well, I am, because our mode of building hydro, not just in the US, but around the world, is to build mega dams. Billion-dollar dams, destroying ecosystems, destroying fisheries. That's why California does not count large dams as part of the clean energy mix.
But they're here. I mean, we have them.
Well, but we have places in the world like British Columbia and Malaysia where we're tearing them out to put run-of-the-river back in and to put run-of-the-river hydro, so non-stream flow destroying systems in place. Now, there are some big dams that are going to persist, but there are many places in the world where the greenhouse gas emissions from those big dams, because of buried vegetation all over the tropics, means that a natural gas power plant life cycle is better than that dam. Now, existing hardware has a way of persisting, but we have examples now of not only California talking about taking out Hetch Hetchy, but we also have discussions in the earliest stages, to go back to the question here about regulation, about turning the Hoover Dam into a load following source, essentially using it as a battery, as Norway is proposing, and minimizing the number of these dams that destroy ecosystems, that destroy indigenous communities, et cetera. So I am quite down on any new dams.
We just have time for one more question.
Yep. You showed that very busy graph on dynamic control between loads and sources. But so my name is Manusha Farkhande from DOE Office of Science. Sorry.
Yeah.
So how affordable is that transition? Is that something that realistically nations can afford?
Yeah, so, I mean, we certainly can afford it if we learn the lessons from solar, right? Which is that a diversity of different technologies, all supported with different experiments at different states and other nations, allow us to move down the learning curve. And that paper I quickly flashed over for storage is that today, storage is improving as fast as solar or wind ever did. Much shorter time history. So if we don't invest, and of course there's always this worry that the federal government in the US, which keeps talking about slashing the R&D budget, would really hurt us, not just because we lose R&D money, but when you lose R&D, you lose the critical demand pull, where everything from California that just declined contracts for 4 new gas peaker power plants in favor of 4 storage options would get those in place. And so this also gets back to the regulation question from Sandia behind you, because there are very straightforward ways to reward energy providers or the utilities that take it for investing in storage, for investing in batteries, for investing in local resilience, maxing efficiency, but we often don't do it. So lots of challenges, but there's some exciting examples of actually making it happen too. So great question, and thank you.
All right, let's thank Dan one more time.